The WNBA is setting record viewing numbers constantly. All eyes are on the rookies, and more people are invested in women's basketball than ever before. But it hasn't always been this way. We'll talk about the rise of attention on women's basketball, how to maintain the momentum, and of course, we'll dive into some Caitlin Clark and some of the rookies that are making it this way right now. All that and more today on Locked On Women's Basketball.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is Locked On Women's Basketball. I'm Talia Goodman. I cover the Indiana Fever for The Next, and our guest for the day, Howard Megdal. He's the founder of The Next. We got him here today. We got the big guns coming in. So he has been investing in women's basketball for ages and helping tell the stories that need to be told in the game. So we'll chat about his career covering the WNBA and his observations from the recent, craziness and attention that women's basketball is garnering. But first, thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by everyone at The Next, a place where we cover women's basketball 24/7, and we tell the stories that need to be told every day. Subscribe now to support the staff at The Next. It's $9 a month or $72 a year, and you can find us at thenexthoops.com. Howard, today we're going to talk about so many things. We're going to talk about what WNBA coverage and attention used to look like. We're going to talk through the rise of attention that we're seeing now. And then, every time I'm talking, I think we got to talk a little bit about Caitlin Clark. But to start off, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Howard, you have been doing this for so long. You were one of the first to really invest in women's basketball. You started up The Next, which covers, solely women's basketball, like such a cool thing. What made you decide that this is what you wanted to invest in and cover to start?
It really is a process over time. So I've been in this business covering sports for about 2 decades coming out of college. And it was one of these processes where you start and you see, when I had the opportunity to cover women's sports, that there was just this enormous gap in coverage that, as you go on and you do it more and more, seems to drive outcomes. And so as I advanced in my career, there was the opportunity to push for more of it within outlets that I was at. And then ultimately the determination I made a little under a decade ago was, I need to create our own. And we need to build the infrastructure so it is there. So we're not building in sand the way so much legacy media outlets, again, for reasons that extend beyond women's sports, and just the larger media landscape is so full of change as well. Wanted something that we could build that would be sustainable over time. And that's where the 9 comes from, where we cover across 6 different women's sports now, and also what we do at The Next, making sure that the coverage is not only there, not only is filled with people, as I extend the ladder down, who don't all look like me, because that is a concurrent but also significantly important part of the sports media landscape, is making sure that there's a greater diversity in those who are doing the coverage, and making sure that all of that can be here to stay.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the gap in coverage at the beginning when you first started. I'm sure it's still there. We know it's still there a little bit, right? But things like the 9 and the Next have come in, and you've been able to kind of close that gap a little bit. What was it like at the beginning when you were just a reporter kind of covering WNBA? What are some of the major differences that we see in coverage and in attention, and how even, things were maybe run back then? What are kind of the key differences that you can point out?
I'll give you just 2 quick stories if I could. One is covering the opening night of the 2015 WNBA season. And it was for the New York Liberty, and Kia Stokes was having her first game, Brittany Boyd having her first game, playing, after being first round draft picks. And you come into that locker room, because at the time the locker room was open, the way it still is, of course, on the NBA side, and there's no one there. There's no one else there. And they were, delightful to talk to. And then Swin Cash has this corner locker at Madison Square Garden. And under other circumstances, I've said this before publicly, that Swin Cash, with her array of successes, would be one of the 10 most famous athletes in the world when you look at what she did in college and for USA basketball and what she did in the WNBA. And of course, now a top executive in the NBA as well. And Swin Cash, again, there was no one there. And it was just so striking. And so even by the time the playoffs rolled around, I remember going to talk to Tamika Catchings for a playoff story when Indiana comes to New York. And so they're playing in Madison Square Garden, literally called the world's most famous arena. Tamika Catchings, if you go by win shares, is not just the most valuable player in WNBA history. She's about 20% higher than anyone else in the entire history of the league. So you put all that together and then you sit there saying, well, why is there no one here to talk to Tamika? I went to ask the PR person, when is she talking? Is she talking pregame? Yeah, she's right over there. Just go talk to her. I mean, it was, there was a certain, joy in that, right? That, Tamika was so accessible, as of course she is to this day. But the bigger part is, and sort of how I felt about it more was, no, there should be a big crowd of us trying to talk to Tamika Catchings. She should have to fit in the timing. And so when you see how many people are around Caitlin Clark at this time in this moment, I know there's some positives, some negatives that go along with it, but it's as it should be.
Right. And it should be, more than just Caitlin Clark too. And I hope, that's where we'll get to in the future where it is. And we're seeing it now. It is more than just Caitlin Clark, which is a good thing. But you started up the Next kind of to fill that gap. What have been kind of your favorite moments or takeaways that you've seen since you've been able to start up this company in kind of how the growth of the game has been or your experiences covering the game, whatever it may be?
I don't want to embarrass you, but working with you has been a really centrally joyful experience for me, and seeing the way you're growing and developing as a writer, as a talent on air, somebody who's doing so much of this work, who was so dedicated to it. If I may, your work on the transfer portal, which then led to the job you were doing at On3, which is just a wonderful thing to see, was just you putting so much time and energy into it. And that's really where it comes back to for me, is being able to create a place where people are able to do the work. So much of the time there's a lack of full-time jobs available for covering women's sports, but also there's a lack of places to get the reps to do it. I am an old in the sense that I grew up in this industry at the very last moment that you could go make your bones at local papers and cover things in a way that train you to do this work, doing a lot of the blocking and tackling that went along with it. And so making sure that we have an opportunity to grow the great young talents in this industry is a significant part of it for me. So I don't mean to single you out. Our staff up and down is filled with talent. And we, of course, have people throughout the industry who have worked with me. It is just, if you're asking, that's my favorite part.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what impressed me the most too, in a different sense, is the community that you've been able to build with the Next, right? Is not just the community of readers, which is so awesome and engaging, but the community even how many of the Next reporters were at the Final Four this year? There were so many. It was such a community of people there. And I think that's what women's basketball needs, right? Because I don't know if I've seen that type of environment or community anywhere else. Definitely nowhere else I've been, but nowhere else I've seen from, where my dad has been, anywhere else. It's really impressive what you've been able to build in terms of just people who are engaged and passionate about building the coverage of this sport up. But
it's really kind of you. And yeah, we had 8 dedicated reporters, you included, at the Final Four, but we also had a number of folks who had written for us in the past at the 9 and the Nets, whether it's Lindsay Gibbs over at Power Plays, who's doing incredible work, people like Sabrina Merchant, who's writing at The Athletic now. It is something that I take a great deal of pride in.
Absolutely. And coming up, we're going to talk about kind of how the past few seasons of college basketball have led to this momentum that the WNBA is having, that women's basketball in general is having. But first, passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. There is no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed as the Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Howard, I have not been doing this as long as you've been doing this, but over the past few years, I've noticed just a momentum shift in the coverage of women's basketball and the interest in women's basketball from kind of casual viewers.
Mhm.
What have you noticed? When was kind of the starting point that you noticed maybe a shift?
I think it's less about a single starting point and more about inputs that have changed outcomes. And so there are a few areas that I see are pretty significant. One, just on the collegiate level, I think the fact that now all the games in the NCAA tournament are available to be able to be seen on TV. I know it seems so obvious, right? But it's just this crazy thing. I have had no shortage of people who are kind of late to it, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but who, let's say, saw Caitlin Clark for the first time and said, wow, what's different about this? And the thing that I always point out is, man, if in 2016 we had the same level of television coverage for women's basketball that we had now, Breanna Stewart would have had that moment. If we had that back in 2010, Maya Moore would have had that moment, and so on. Tamika Catchings in the late 1990s. It's less about, Caitlin Clark, although Caitlin Clark is doing things that we haven't seen before, as I'm sure we'll talk about, but every one of these players I mentioned was doing things we hadn't seen before, and not enough people saw it. I remember having a conversation with Tamika Catchings at a USA basketball practice. It was in her final season as an active player. And I remember her kind of talking, and we kind of realized in real time, she was talking about it in the present of how we get to this in 2016. And then she kind of had to check herself because she's retiring to say, well, it won't be in my career. And I just remember coming away so sad from that because the inputs were different. I think you see the same thing on the WNBA side. The investment that the league had, 16% of the league sold for $75 million, a bargain basement number when you look now. But what the league was able to do with it was to invest in infrastructure in a lot of ways on the business side. When we keep getting these emails over and over again, this new partner, that new partner, the change makers, like that doesn't just happen. You can't just expect that to show up at your door financially. You need to have the folks on the business side who are doing that. And I am a big believer that the new media rights deal is going to allow them to invest in other ways as well, up to and including player salaries that will, and this is a very big deal, help to limit, if not eliminate, the need for players to have to go overseas to make a living. That's been a big deal, having more players in market year round. It's already provided all these benefits. So a lot of these different things coming together at the same time have been, I think, critical for the growth of the league. And then I think you're seeing other people recognize that there needs to be more coverage as well. And so that's another input that leads to a change in outcomes.
What's one, if you're talking to kind of a newer fan or a casual fan or someone who's just kind of learning to love the game, right? What's a moment or a game or a story or something that should be the first thing that they know when they're getting into this? What's something that not Caitlin Clark, not something from the last year or two, what's something that they should go back and watch?
That is hard. I think the folks who have treated the last couple of years, the Aces and the Liberty, so this is even, say a little bit more invested as, these are the very first super teams, need to go back and watch the Minnesota Lynx during the period of the 2010s when they won 4 WNBA titles and were in the finals 2 other times. And need to go back and see the Comets, the Houston Comets of the first few seasons of the WNBA, and to see that there has been this incredible top line level of talent that's been there throughout. I guess I would start there with those two, but it's very hard. There's been this long, winding story. Man, I mean, the University of Tennessee teams of the late 1990s on the collegiate side, things people need to see and hear about. And we do it all the time with the WBL coverage that we do. It's so important that people understand the WNBA is not the first women's professional league, and the level of talent with Molly Bolin and Ann Myers Drysdale, and the list goes on and on. Liz Galloway, McQuitter is incredible for the WBL from 1978 to 1981. Those are the original Title Niners. Those are the folks. Title IX's 1972. They're coming through college, and now here you are, 1978 through 1981. They're the pros who are putting that into practice.
And you know what I would recommend, in my completely unbiased opinion, is to go on thenexthoops.com and read some of the awesome stories that reporters have done, not just from the past few years, but kind of diving backwards, and even from 4 or 5 years ago isn't that long ago. So go back and read about those seasons too. But there's just so much that, even as I obviously know the college game a little bit more than I know the WNBA game. And as I've been trying to learn more of the history, it's been so helpful to be able to go back in those archives and look at it all. But
can I just say, just to shout out our incredible staff, we started in June of 2020 at The Next, and we passed 5,000 reported pieces at The Next last month in the duration of our history. So I am incredibly proud of the permanent archive, because that will never go away. I will make sure that never goes away.
That'll keep you busy for a while. If you're going to read 5,000 stories, you can knock that out in a year or so, maybe.
People should just take sabbaticals from their jobs. I agree.
Yes, yeah. That's what I recommend to everyone listening. Exactly. No, don't hold me to that. I didn't say that. And you mentioned a few things that kind of got us to the point that we're at now. Now, what do we do going forward to maintain this momentum, and not just maintain it, but grow this momentum even further? What are kind of the most important things, whether it is for the college game or at the professional level? What are the things that not we as fans or even we as media have to do, but kind of we as the world have to do?
It is, everything comes down to the everyday, the keep showing up. There are going to be these big events that can be bigger because the baseline starts from a higher place. And I have seen this many times in women's sports, and even before I started covering, there were these waves that would wash forward. And then when the wave recedes, how do you make sure that low tide is where it needs to be as well, so the next wave can get even further ashore? And so I think from a fan perspective, from a media perspective, from all of these ways, it is the every day. There were a lot of folks who looked for sort of a magic answer to how to fix what was this systemic problem. And no, you fix systemic problems by addressing them in systemic ways. And so, yes, there needs to be a continued growth in the day-to-day, right? Not just for Caitlin Clark, not just for the Indiana Fever, but for the entire league and for college, and understanding. And this was a thing that people struggled with for a long time. The idea that college and pro was not part of the same story, in a way that we would never question when it comes to top flight men's college basketball leading into the NBA. But somehow there was a divide. And even at the league level, the WNBA, and I had presidents of the WNBA say out loud, muse out loud, how do we turn this particular year of college coverage into the pros? What do we actually see happen this year? The WNBA advertising on the NCAA tournament games on the women's side. It seems so basic, but remember two things. One is the WNBA didn't always have the capital to do that. And number two, the college games weren't all on TV either. So in all of these different ways, right? And no, it doesn't sound like one person must do one thing. It's got to be systemic.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And coming up, we're going to talk about some of those players who helped us recently get to where we are now, including, of course, Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever, like we just mentioned. But first, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little bit different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every single regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit fanduel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Now, Howard, I know it's not all about Caitlin Clark. I know that. There's so much more to women's basketball than Caitlin Clark, but what she has been able to do for women's basketball is, I would say, unprecedented for the league right now. And what have you kind of noticed through her college career, right, where maybe her freshman and sophomore year, it wasn't the national attention that we had her junior and senior year, right? And now heading into the WNBA, what she's been able to do to transfer that attention from the college game to the professional levels. What are your kind of just observations at the basic level? What have you kind of seen for what she's been able to do for the game?
Well, so there are two parts to it, right? And I am writing a book about Caitlin Clark and the rise of Caitlin Clark, how it came about, which is to say that it was not Caitlin alone. There was a system in place that made her the perfect player. And I would argue the system in place created those perfect elements to take advantage of this moment in time. I don't mean that she's a perfect player. I mean the perfect player for the moment.
Yeah.
And you go back and you're right. I remember writing about covering Caitlin Clark. It was very easy to see her games on digital only. There was no, I mean, I had to watch her first few games at University of Iowa on Big Ten, BTN Plus on my iPad. I remember doing it because you couldn't even watch it on television at that time. So those things change dramatically in terms of how people are able to access her game. Her game itself being part of Iowa's fast-paced experience. Well, this dates back, frankly, to Iowa 6-on-6 girls basketball, which has been played for over a century. It was the way it was played through the state tournament through 1993, a fast-paced, offense-intensive experience. And it really, in a lot of ways, shaped the way Jan Jensen and Lisa Bluter grew up playing the game, grew up coaching the game. And of course, Lisa was her head coach. Jan was the associate head coach, now the head coach at Iowa for Caitlin Clark, who grew up in that atmosphere as well. What does that mean in terms of what kind of show she's able to put on? Well, it turns her into somebody who is incredible as a shooter. Of course, she is somebody who shoots the ball the way Molly Bolin did 50 years ago in the state of Iowa. She is somebody who passes the ball in a way that was pioneered by the Van Horn girls high school basketball team. Can you tell I've been in the Iowa women's archives a lot this summer? And the Van Horn girls basketball team, they talked about it at the time. It was a bunch of guards, a guard-oriented game. This has changed girls basketball forever, was what the opposing coach said after they won the title. And it goes directly to the idea that Caitlin Clark is a product of her environment, of her time, but she's also doing it at this moment. Again, that NCAA games were widely available. She was doing it at this moment that the WNBA, people talk about the ratings increase, and there are multiple elements to it, right? The Caitlin Clark games are obviously bigger than the other games in terms of the total audience, but you are also seeing the non-Caitlin Clark games up by more than 35% year over year. If you just isolated them out against all the WNBA games, and the WNBA audience has been steadily growing dating back to the pandemic year as well of 2020. You put it all together and it fundamentally means that it is a person putting on a show. It is a person, by the way, who already set the rookie assist record, and there's still about a third of the season left to go. Might be a better passer than a shooter, which is saying something. And by the way, playing for an Indiana Fever team that has talent up and down the roster, just went out and beat Seattle, just went out and beat Phoenix. Anybody who thinks Indiana is not a title contender hasn't watched them lately.
I like that take. And now you talking through this, you got me even more excited to read your book. So I'm gonna need you to hurry up on that and send me an advanced reader's copy. I'm gonna need one in my mail as soon as.
I promise you will. And it'll be out next spring of 2025.
Oh, I'm so excited. And I bet everyone else who is listening is so excited to get their hands on a copy too. So thank you so much, Howard, for joining me today to talk about kind of your career, how coverage has kind of expanded, and how you've been able to help fill the gap with the Next. It has really been such a wonderful space to be a part of and be able to read, and I've loved it. But thank you
for
again.
being amazing.
Thank you. And thank you guys again for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen today. Now go check out the Locked On NBA podcast where the season never ends, providing national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NBA in the description so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.